I'm Rabbi Daniel Lappin, and I welcome you, happy warrior, to this show. It's not that easy being a happy warrior right now, is it? Many people, most of us, I would say, are coping with the coronavirus outbreak as warriors, right? We're not folding up our tents and surrendering. No, we are warriors. We're doing everything we can to cope and survive and perhaps even to thrive. To remain happy warriors is even more of a challenge. But I think it helps to remember that, first of all, happiness is a decision we make. It's not contingent on external circumstances at all. An older woman I met in New York a few years ago had survived the Nazi concentration camps during World War II, and she was a young girl. She was less than 10 years old when she was in the camp, when she was taken to the camp with her mother. Her mother obviously did not make it, and I asked her to tell me a little bit about it, and what I heard her say was really rather remarkable. She said that her mother said that even in these conditions, which we have never been able to imagine, nothing in our previous lives could in any way have prepared us for the horror and barbarism that we witness each and every day in these camps. But even here, our purpose is to be happy and to produce and contribute to the happiness of other people. And she said, "Mommy, I'm 8 years old. What can I do?" And she said, "Your job is to walk around at all times that you are awake. You must have a smile on your face. That's your job." And she says that's what kept her alive. That's what kept her going. She had a purpose. She had a job. And she says, in hindsight, looking back now, she knows she really did make a contribution. To see a little girl skipping with a smile on her face, even if she was starving, and even if deep inside she was weeping for what was happening, but in some way, people's lives were improved by that. And so, yes, being happy is something that we can decide to do. The situation is what it is. There are certain things we can do, and I'm going to talk about them in this show. And there are a whole lot of things we can't do anything about, but we can be happy. So what are the 10 timeless tips, tools, and techniques for tough times? Well, of course, each person can come up with their own list, but to the best of my ability, I used the resources of ancient Jewish wisdom to provide 10 specifics. Number one, and this one is number one for a reason, and that is become a generalist. You've got to start now to train yourself to be a generalist. Now, this goes entirely against everything you believe, everything you know, certainly everything I have taught, which is that in order to most effectively serve other people, in order to most effectively create a career serving other people, which is the surest way of making sure that you will earn money, you need to specialize. Anybody who sets out in life to become everything to everyone is not going to succeed at all. There is that wonderful quote from John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden, and he's speaking about a character who plays a minor role in the novel. And here's what Steinbeck says about him. The guy's name was Alf, probably short for Alfred. Alf was a jack of all trades: carpenter, tinsmith, blacksmith, electrician, plasterer, scissors grinder, and cobbler. Alf could do anything, and as a result, he was a financial failure, although he worked all the time. Isn't that incredible? It's so well put, and that's exactly right. Specialize, specialize, specialize. You've got to find the one best way that you can serve other people in your orbit. And so there is no question about that. I've spoken about it. I've taught it in the context even of why it is that Jacob spent 30 verses giving separate blessings to each one of his sons at the end of the book of Genesis, instead of simply saying, boys, it's been an honor to be your father. Some of you have been a giant pain in the neck. Take care of each other. I'm going home to the Lord. Goodbye. One verse, that's how I could have done it. Jacob took 30 verses. And then at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses does the same thing with the 12 tribes. Right? An entire chapter giving a separate... Why? Because let's put it this way, one of the great things that parents want to see is their children loving one another and taking care of one another, helping one another. That's what parents want to see. That's also what our Father in heaven obviously wants to see. One of the surest ways of doing that is to make sure that your children all need one another. And specialization is the surest way of making sure that each person is needed. If Alf, who could do everything, Alf just, took care of all his own needs, so he didn't use anybody else, and you'd think to yourself, well, that's an advantage in this world, isn't it? Not to have to use anybody else. No, it's a terrible idea, because it means that you never get really good at any one thing. And only by getting really good and finally reputation famous, that's the value in it, where people recognize that you have achieved professional status in whatever it is you do. I had my shoes polished. What happened was we were at Union Station in Washington, D.C. We had to catch a train. There wasn't a single chair to wait. Everything was fully occupied. The only chair I saw empty was at the shoe shine in Union Station. And so I immediately decided, well, I'm going to get a shoe shine. And up I hopped, and there was another waiting chair there that Susan Lappin took. And we thought, you know what, as long as the shoe shine takes, at least we'll sit, and then after that we'll head to the train. Well, I must tell you, the man's name was Kevin. And did we have an interesting... Well, I hope he found it as interesting as I did. I found it interesting, but because I realized I was talking to a highly trained professional. I was talking to somebody who knew more about shoes than I ever would. And he was telling me some of the things he could tell about people and shoes just by looking at them. And I smiled and I said, you are a professional. There's no question about it. And I'm honored to have you do my shoes. I appreciate it. So anyways, that's how the world works. If Kevin would have spent his mornings doing cooking for one of the restaurants and the afternoons doing shoe shining, he wouldn't have been particularly good at any of them. But this way, he was extraordinary, all of which is by way of telling you and explaining that in normal times and for purposes of earning a living, specialization is the way to go. However, for managing tough times, you have to be a generalist. There was a Scottish author, his name was J.M. Barrie, and he wrote Peter Pan. He died just before World War II. But a few years before he wrote Peter Pan, in the early years of the 20th century, he wrote a play called The Admirable Crichton. And I would definitely recommend that you know about this play. You don't see it put on the stage that much these days, and that's a shame, I think. But the point of the play, and I'm going to tell it to you now, it's worthwhile knowing about because it's very much what we're discussing. So, set in pre-World War I England, and Crichton, 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 is the name of the butler of an aristocratic family. Okay, I think his name was the Earl of Loam. And he was a British aristocrat, and he, with his wife and daughter, living a very privileged life in London, upper crust. And Crichton is the butler. and the butler knows his place, of course, and there's several incidents that take place during the first part of the play that shows that they are good to Crichton, but he's the servant. He's the downstairs, they're the upstairs. It's as simple as that. However, finally, we get to the drama of the play. And what happens then is that, and it's not important how this came about, but the Earl of Loam and his family and some friends, they were on a little ship journey. They got shipwrecked on a deserted island, a desert island somewhere, and they land on the island, and guess what? The Earl of Loam and his wife and his daughters and all their upper crust friends are totally without any resources. They literally do not know how to do anything about shelter. None of them have ever caught a fish or cooked a meal. None of them know anything about how to make a fire. And all of a sudden, Crichton, the former butler, emerges as the resourceful guy here, who is the only one with any practical knowledge. And they all start turning to him. Automatically, he emerges as a leader. And, I've often spoken about the way that leadership is defined. And when I was writing Thou Shalt Prosper, I went to the trouble of asking the heads of a number of famous business schools around the world for their definition of what is a leader. And they all gave various definitions. Some of them were clever, but none of them were actually useful. In the final analysis, I believe that the Rabbi Daniel Lapin definition of a leader is the only one that is 100% true and actually useful. You want to know what a leader is? A leader is somebody who has followers. End of story. That's all it is. And it happens organically. It happens on a spiritual level where people feel drawn to your leadership. Then that is what's going on. Well, you watch this thing happening during the play. There they are on the island, and little by little, they all start turning to the butler, to Crichton, for guidance, what they should be doing, how they're going to eat. And Crichton organizes and begins to play the role of a leader, not trying to at all, because deep in his heart, he is a butler. But this is what he does. He's the only one who's able to create a reliable food supply, which he does, and they're all very happy to follow his lead. And time goes by. They're on this island for a couple of years, I think, and what happens is Crichton has taught them how to build houses, and he's taught them how to do agriculture, and the funny thing is that he is now treated the way his former master, the Earl of Loam, used to be treated. And it so elegantly does J.M. Barrie invert the social relationships that, little by little, the Earl of Loam becomes the person who takes orders from Crichton in terms of, how to grow stuff and how to find water and do all these things. And then At a certain point, a ship shows up to rescue them. And if I remember correctly, only Crichton was aware of that, I believe. And he had a moment, and you can see this with a good actor. This was a pleasure to watch. You can see Crichton going through internal turmoil. Does he really want to be rescued and go back and resume his downstairs status as the butler to the Earl of Loam? If he just does not reveal to anybody that that there is a ship, they'll stay there, and life for him is pleasant. He's about to marry the Earl of Loam's daughter, which is preposterous in London. Right, the Earl of Loam's daughter used to be engaged to some Lord Brockleby or something back in London, Brocklehurst back in London, and here she's proud and happy to marry Crichton. So for him, there's every reason to stay right where he is. However, the Honourable Crichton, or the Admirable Crichton as the title of the play is, reveals his presence, he signals the ship, and everybody is rescued. And as soon as they're rescued, as soon as they're back on the ship, Crichton resumes his status as a butler. So in times of crisis, you want to be able to be a generalist. And how does that serve us? Well, for one thing, it means that you're able to do many of the things yourself, and it's not a bad time to learn. If you're not by nature a generalist, then use something like video trainings available on the internet. Learn how to change your own car oil, learn how to fix your own heating and air conditioning. If the sometimes the toilet stops flushing because a chain is broken in the tank or a valve isn't right. These things are really simple to repair. You just, learn how to do these things and become a generalist. Take care of all the little odd jobs around the house that you never have time to get to. There is something very satisfying about fixing something with tools. You might even find that if you don't yet own a toolbox, now might be a really good time to get hold of one. So that's all part of being a generalist. More importantly, perhaps, I think it's also very important to know that a crisis can never be fully comprehended by experts and specialists. That you have to know. An infantry commander down on the battlefield might send a message back to headquarters, and he'd say, the most important thing right now is more artillery. And from his point of view, he's exactly right. Meanwhile, a naval commander on board a ship conducting a battle or a blockade, he might send a message back, nothing matters more than fuel for our ships. We're running out of fuel. Maybe in the Air Force, a bomber pilot might radio back to base and say, if we cannot overcome enemy anti-aircraft fire, all will be lost. And now, the thankless task of the commander-in-chief is to determine how to allocate resources and where to focus efforts. Each of his warriors told him the truth, but it was the truth of an expert. It was the narrow truth of a specialist. And for the overall conduct of the war, each of those pieces of information is useful, but they won't necessarily all be acted upon as they wish. It is possible that the commander-in-chief has decided that that something is expendable. In order to win the war, he might be willing to lose a battle. Is preserving life always the most important thing? Well, there was a tragic event in World War II that is described. Winston Churchill's doctor, I think, was the one who wrote about this in his diary, and that is that Great Britain had uncovered the secret of Enigma, which was the name of the German military coding device. And working at Bletchley Park, a number of mathematicians and scientists and physicists, who later, many of them became famous in other areas. I believe John von Neumann was there, very important later on in computing and artificial intelligence. These guys actually broke the code. And it was without doubt something that significantly shortened World War II. The fact that the Allies, Britain and America, had access to all the German instructions to their commanders in the field. Everything that went from Berlin to the field was decoded at Bletchley Park almost in real time and provided to the British War Cabinet. Well, one of the things they discovered was that on that night or the next night, the city of Coventry was going to be heavily bombed. It was going to be flattened. The reason was that Coventry was where a number of very important. Coventry was a place that sort of really took off during the Industrial Revolution, and it's a sort of a wonderful city with many, many qualities in the middle of England, and it was going to be destroyed because it was the place where many of the most important manufacturing centers for the war effort were located. And they were obviously going to attack the civilian part of Coventry because they decided if they could cause enough havoc there wouldn't be people to come and work in the factories, and so this would cause a slowdown in Britain's wartime production. And Churchill, as the commander-in-chief, had to decide, does he order an evacuation of Coventry to save lives, or does he stay put? The reason not to do that was that it would immediately identify to German spies that they've broken the code. If out of the blue, just after Berlin notified the Luftwaffe, you're going to be doing a bombing run on Coventry tomorrow night, if at that point Britain decided to evacuate Coventry, it would have been a clear hint to the Germans that their code was broken, and it would set the war back very, very seriously. And I believe it was Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor, if I remember correctly, who wrote how the tears poured down Churchill's cheeks. He was a very emotional guy, and he wept and wept and wept once he had made the decision that he was not going to save Coventry. So lives were lost, many lives were lost, and it was tragic. But the war was shortened as a result of that. So I mentioned that in the context of this, as I've spoken about in previous shows as well, that you have to be aware that specialists see things from a specialist's point of view. I've often quoted Jewish psychologist Abraham Maslow. He wrote a book called The Psychology of Science. He wrote it in the early 1960s, I believe it was. And he says, in the book, he said, I'm not quoting it word for word, but he says, I witnessed one of the first of an elaborate machine that could automatically wash cars, right? Car wash. Today they're very common, but in the 60s they were new. And he said, and I watched cars came to this machine, and it did a beautiful job of washing them. But that's all it could do. And anything else that got into the clutches of that machine was treated as if it was an automobile to be washed. Okay, that is, in other words, to a car wash machine, anything that comes into it is a car that needs washing. And then he finished off by saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail. And I think it's important to understand that right now, doctors, for whom I have the greatest of respect, with a lifetime invested in their medical careers, they see one truth, just like the infantry commander saw one truth, and the naval captain saw one truth, and the bomber pilot saw one truth. Doctors are seeing one truth about the current crisis. Economists are seeing another truth. Maybe historians see yet another, and so on. Now, you've got to remember that newspapers and television and all other media are absolutely ravenous for content. They just want more material. And they'll happily publish information, whether it comes from, if you like, the infantry, the Navy, or the Air Force. And they'll publish it as the words of an expert, of a specialist. And they're exactly right, it is. But your job as commander-in-chief of your own life and of your family, well, that's to be a generalist. And you should certainly use data from experts and specialists out there in the battlefield. And your job is not to just take the word of this expert. What sort of leader would you be if you were commander-in-chief and the naval officer said, we've got to have fuel? So you immediately reallocate resources of your country to supply fuel to the Navy. And just then the infantry commander says, we've got to have more artillery. And so you stop that and you turn all the factories and all the effort around in the entire war production. You say, forget the oil, we got to do shells and cannons. And then the bomber pilot says, We need defenses against anti-aircraft. We need more machine guns. And you stop the production of cannon and you start going, and you're just jumping from one thing to another as each expert sounds out. That's a little bit like what's going on right now at the time that I'm preparing this show for you, which is the last week of the month of March 2020, of course. And so your job as commander-in-chief, and you're a boss of yourself, and you're commander-in-chief, you're responsible for your family. You've got to be a generalist. Don't fall into the trap of being a specialist. If you are a leader, and you are because you have people following you, well, you must certainly take the data from the specialists and the experts, but then it's your job to integrate it, combine it, and draw a wise conclusion as to what's really going on out there. And from that point, you're in a far better position to determine strategy. But, don't email around to everybody you know, every article you see from a doctor, from an emergency room specialist, from an epidemiologist. Okay, you've got to hear what they say, but they're specialists. You hear a politician giving a press conference, and I'm leaving out President Trump in this thing because I do believe history will record, in my view is history will record him as being a very effective commander-in-chief during this corona crisis. But there are a lot of other politicians who are treating the crisis as a means to get more of their lifeblood, camera exposure. But they're also specialists. They might be trying to win an election. They might be trying to replace the front runner in the Democratic nomination process. Who knows? But they're specialists. And so it is. All of these specialists, they all have something to say, but you don't need to treat the statement of any one of them as if it was something engraved in granite, as if it's tablets from the mountain. No, it's to that person invested in his own career, politics, economics, history, finance, medicine, whatever it is. It's like a hammer. Everything looks like a nail to a hammer. And so to the medical expert, the only solution here is medical. And to the economist, well, there are other dangers. To the medical guy, the only danger is the virus. To the economist, perhaps there are other dangers. To the historian might say, every time there's been unemployment in this country, there's been a huge spike in death rate through suicide, depression. Yeah, let's be aware of that. Okay, so take that information into account. And so it is, you define your strategy. So there you got it. The first of the 10 timeless tips, tools, and techniques is make of yourself a generalist. The second one, number 2, is remember that today's strategic timeline ends tonight. Now, again, in normal times, we train ourselves and those we are privileged to lead and the children we may be privileged to raise. We train all of us to not be focused on the present. I mean, how destructive is it, right? You only have to look at the parts of American society, or for that matter, the parts of British society that are doing the worst in terms of economic progress, in terms of crime, in terms of social behavior, in terms of academic success. You only have to look and you'll see that people who live their life and raise their children to live for today don't do well. They do not do well at all, to say the least. And it's obvious. I don't have to spend any time on that. And so we spend a lot of time and we train ourselves to do hard things. Like we give away money to other people with less than ourselves. That's uncomfortable, reaching into your pocket and giving away some of your money. It means less for you. But we do that because we have an obligation to our past and to the teachings of our parents. These things compel us. Right? I was raised to not be able to tolerate selfishness, to not be able to think of myself with any sense of self-esteem if I don't give away to people who have less. And so if I only live for today, then who cares what my parents taught me? But I don't. I live with the past and the future as well as the present. And so many things I do because of the past. There are other things I do because of the future. Exercising, eating wisely, saving money instead of spending money. These are burdensome things. These are not fun things to do. But we do them because we have an obligation to the future as well. So, yes, we all do certain arduous things today so that we will be able to do other things that are desirable in 5 years' time. Right? That's common. So, ordinarily, we put a lot of effort and energy into teaching ourselves to not be focused on today, but to be focused on tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and even next decade. And that's how we live. But during tough times, there is such a thing also as simply learning how to live with your timeline extending up until tonight. You've basically got to get through today. You've got to ask yourself, or let me say, don't ask yourself. If you would say to yourself, hey, I don't know how I'm possibly going to make this for another 3 weeks. Or listen, hey, do you know I heard a politician say at a press conference yesterday, this could carry on for 18 months? Idiot. I also heard that politician saying that. Idiot. It's totally non-sustainable it's not sustainable for 6 months, as I've already told you. But anyways, you hear that. You go ahead and believe it because you haven't listened to the show yet, and you say, how am I going to make it for another 18 months? I don't know that I can make this for another 2 months. That's all wrong thinking. At times of tough times and crisis times, that's a mistake. It can make you feel overwhelmed and hopeless. Instead, what you have to tell yourself is, I just have to get through today. Things are changing day by day. And tomorrow, I'll deal with tomorrow. There was a woman just died a few decades ago, not that long ago. She lived in California, but she grew up in Holland. Her name was Corrie ten Boom. And she wrote an amazing story. A wonderful book called The Hiding Place. Is it The Hidden Room or The Hiding Place? I'm so sorry, folks. I should have checked this up more clearly before. But anyway, it was about how her family saved Jews in Holland during the World War II. A remarkable woman, absolutely a remarkable woman, and I'm sure well known to many of you in terms of the book. So she says, worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow, it empties today of its strength. And it's very applicable. Don't worry about tomorrow now. If you've done everything you have to do, or everything you can do, I mean, there's not a whole lot one can do, right? So worry doesn't empty tomorrow of its sorrow, but it does empty today of its strength. From ancient Jewish wisdom, when God spoke to Moses at the burning bush in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, and he tells him, listen, you've got to go to the Israelites. This is what you tell them. Hey, it's time now to leave Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. I'm going to take you out of Egypt. Moses says, what name should I use to tell them who you are? And there is a strange passage there in chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 13. God says, well, I will be who I will be. In Hebrew, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be who I will be. This is a very mystical kind of name. And what does that mean? And ancient Jewish wisdom fills it in and says that actually God said, oh, you want to know my name? This is what you have to tell them. Tell them, I will be for them here and save them, just as I will be for them in other trials, tribulations, ordeals, and oppressions that lie ahead of them in Jewish history. Just as I will be with them for all of those, I will be with them for this. I will be who I will be. And Moses said, God, please leave out all that stuff. There's no benefit in telling the Israelites now of other future ordeals and oppressions that they're going to endure many years into the future ahead. Don't tell them that now. In crisis times, it's enough to deal with today. And God accepted Moses' request and replied, okay, just tell them I will be who I will be. That's all. And that's what that means. Every day, making it through each day is a triumph. Those of you who've got children at home and you at the same time worrying about job, worrying about finances, you get through the day reasonably cheerfully with everybody being as happy as possible and everybody manages. You know what? Give yourself a great big pat on the back. Try and get a really good night's sleep, and tomorrow will be tomorrow. Tip number 3, do your best to insulate yourself from public panic and hysteria. In earlier shows, I've spoken about this as well, but for the sake of completion, in my list of 10 timeless tips, tools, and techniques, I wanted to repeat, insulate yourself from public panic and hysteria. Science can certainly tell what things and what animals will do with a high degree of statistical probability, right? You submerge some copper into an acid and you know what's going to happen. You train animals and then you give them the stimulus, whether it's a bell or food or a sign, and you know what they're going to do. But science can never predict what people are going to do. If what we as individual people do was as scientifically predictable as what copper will do in an acid, the entire clothing fashion industry would be dead, right? Because from a scientific point of view, you need clothing only for shelter to keep body temperature within a safe range. Paying more money for clothes that advertise the manufacturer's label is utterly irrational and unscientific. And so much else of what we do with our money, with our buying choices, so much of that makes no sense from a scientific point of view, which is one of the reasons why economics is really not satisfactorily treated in the mathematics or scientific department. They try and give it a new name, econometrics. The truth is, everybody knows that economics is based on human decisions about money, and human beings make money decisions for spiritual as well as for scientific reasons. Look at the whole area of extreme sports. I mean, people do really dangerous, I shouldn't have said people, men, males, people who are males in a scientific biological sense tend to do extreme sports, right? People die from parachuting off tall structures like antenna towers or skyscrapers. People die from that. That's a lot more dangerous than going to play frisbee in the park. Mountain climbing, like major mountain climbing. People die from that, right? People do these things. And so from a scientific point of view, if we were really nothing but animals, then no animal would ever do these things. Why? No animal on earth risks its life for what? A high? That's what people say, right? People do. Oh, you can't believe what a high you get from extreme sport. A high is a spiritual term. It means heaven, upwards, right? And people seek highs with drugs, with alcohol. All of these are to satisfy a spiritual yearning. Am I saying that if my soul was in good shape, I would have absolutely no attraction to crossing oceans in small sailing boats? I'm not going to go there just to entertain you, so I'm going to leave the curtain pulled over that part of my psyche and my soul. But the point is that we make non-scientific decisions. So obviously, science cannot predict how we're going to behave. Science is a really bad tool for trying to figure out human individual behavior. Figuring out animals, usually no problem. But the one exception is that science can predict what a crowd or a mob of people will do. And the reason is obvious, because a mob of people is not a human being, it's an animal. It really behaves like a multi-headed, multi-footed animal. And animals are largely predictable. And so just be aware that you don't want to be part of that mob. It's an important point that the darkest time in Jewish history is said to have been the building of the golden calf. I mean, just think about it, right? The Lord has taken them out of slavery with incredible miracles they've witnessed. He took them through the Red Sea with miraculous timing, split the Red Sea, and then made the waters go back and drown out the Egyptian army. And now they've heard the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. How remarkable is that? And then Exodus chapter 32. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, and then came the golden calf. And it was incredibly destructive. There isn't time for me now to go into what the problems are that were caused by the golden calf, but they were huge and reverberate through Jewish history to the present time. So how did that happen? How did people who had seen so much, had literally been favored by God in ways that had never happened in human history before, how is it possible that just because Moses was late according to their calculations, that they suddenly perpetrated this mass betrayal, this treacherous act of idolatry? If there was one thing that God stressed when he gave them the Ten Commandments a few weeks ago, he said, no other gods. I mean, that's really clear. And what do? They build a golden calf. Now, how does this come about? It comes about because of one very important word in the text. It doesn't just say when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountains, they came to Aaron and said, make us a god that'll go before us. No. There's one important word. And the Hebrew word there is vayikahel ha'am. The people gathered, and then they came to Aaron. That's right, they became a mob. When a crowd gathers, you can see it becoming scary as it begins to acquire mob characteristics. And so that crucial word, vayikahel in Hebrew, the people gathered, that's saying they turned into a mob. Not a single one of those people as an individual would ever have said, hey, we should do idolatry. But once it was a mob, it was unstoppable. And that is why we know that Aaron said to them, okay, get the earrings and the jewelry from your families and bring it. He was hoping that the families would say, hey, we're not giving up our jewelry. But by this time, everybody was part of the mob. Why did Aaron not try to stop them and say, hey, Israelites, are you crazy? You've just heard God give the Ten Commandments. You can't, because he knew they'd kill him. That is the feverishness and frenzy and fanaticism that overtakes a mob. And right now, there is mob psychology going on about the virus. And so you must do everything you can to insulate yourself and your family from that panic and that hysteria. It may mean that you should watch less news, listen to less news. That may be what it is. Be very selective in what you listen to, because the stuff gets into your head and it becomes very difficult to think really clearly. Please don't overestimate your ability to filter out information. That's not how God created us. We are people who are very, very influenced by things we see and things we hear. We really are. And so the only thing to do is to restrict the amount that comes into your mind, into your soul, into your head, and the amount that comes into your families as well. Maybe it needs to be restricted. Rather, maybe watch a video of the J.M. Barrie play, The Admirable Crichton, rather than watching a newscast or watching another press conference or watching another politician talk or watch another panel of doctors say how this is going to wipe out tens of thousands of people in the United States. It isn't. But for now, I can't go into why I know that. Okay, item number 4. Tip and technique number 4, use the time to make new connections. People are actually very approachable now, not in person, but people are very approachable electronically. And so many people, if you think about it, people for either social reasons or maybe for business reasons, people you wanted to make contact with but haven't been able to do, they are much more open during a time of crisis, during tough times, than they are ordinarily. So use the opportunity. Make a list of the people you want to reach. Call them up, send them an email, set up a Skype or a Zoom or a Ring Central connection, talk to them, use the time to make those connections. They will stand you in very good stead once this is all over, sooner rather than later, and life can begin to returning to what will be the new normal. Won't ever be exactly the same as before, right? Just like 9/11 in the United States of America. To a large extent, America did get back to normal remarkably quickly. Stock market came back, people got back, flying came back, everything came back. It was really, really rather remarkable. But certain things didn't. The dreadful TSA as a reality in our lives was created by George W. Bush, and there it is. Instead of letting each airline handle its own security, this has now created a new government bureaucracy that'll last forever, and that's a real shame. I should tell you that I had a wonderful opportunity. I was speaking at an economics conference a few years ago in Mexico, and also there, a far more important speaker than me was the late Sir John Templeton, the creator of the entire Templeton Funds, and surely one of the most legendary and successful investors of all time. And I had an opportunity to talk to him. There were no people around, and he was alone, so I seized the chance to make the connection, introduced myself, and asked if we can chat. I had some questions I'd like to ask. He was very gracious, very happy to do so. He had a nurse with him at that point who was, I just happen to remember noting, an extraordinary, attractive-looking and beautiful young nurse who was with him full-time. And there it is. It was... I think many of the men at the conference thought that there really is an advantage in being a successful investor. So Sir John Templeton, he's sitting, and I say to him, this may be a ridiculous question, Sir John. Don't hesitate to just blow it off if there's not any answer that springs to mind right away. I've got other questions. But is there anything that stands out as one of your most successful investments on the spur of the moment, where you went into something and the reason you went in for worked out? It was just a huge... He says, yeah, I'll tell you exactly what it was. He says, I went deeply into airline stocks as soon as the market opened after 9/11. And I said, that's extraordinary. How did you know? And he said something which I should have realized myself right away. And that was, he said, people are always going to need to do business. And if you're doing business, you're always going to need to meet face to face. And that's 100% true. In the final analysis, we build up a relationship and we build up a sense of trust with somebody when we sit together with them face by face. Usually over a meal is a very good and successful technique. And he said, so I knew eventually the market would return. So that was tip number 4. Use the opportunity to make connections, either renew connections or make new connections, but it is a good time for doing that. Number 5 is very short, very simple, very straightforward. Cash is king. Conserve cash to the best of your ability. Right? You don't need me to tell you any more than that. The only thing I believe one should take into account is that it is possible that at a time of crisis, at troubled times, there may be very good buys to be had. It is whether we're talking about investments or whether we're talking about consumer products, but whatever it is, you might want to be aware that there is no question that in many areas there are things that could be purchased now for much less than you'll be able to buy them in 4 or 5 weeks' time. So now you have to balance it out. Cash is king. You've got to conserve your cash. You've got to make sure you have cash. But if you do have enough and you're not worried, then to use some of it for purchasing things you were going to purchase down the road anyway, or for making investments at a time when the market has been artificially depressed by the panic and the hysteria. Again, being very selective and being very thoughtful, but just to be aware. This is a time to think a little bit about cash, conserving, and exactly what to use it for. Okay, we're up to tip, tool, and technique number 6. Number 6 is your life and those of your family are more valuable to you than to the authorities. Please be aware of that. It would be nice if we could simply trust and say, don't worry, government is going to take your interests into account. But it's not so simple. Obviously, you place infinite value on your life and that of your family, and so you should. But don't think that government or any of the authorities do the same, and I'm not even going to say they ought to. I've given the example many times before that if saving or keeping the risk lowest for you and your family, if that is the be-all and end-all, then introduce a nationwide 20-mile-an-hour speed limit and eliminate 30 to 40,000 road deaths a year in the United States of America. Obviously, government authority has decided 30 or 40,000 deaths a year is okay. And we've elected that government, and obviously we think it. Now, if a genie popped out of a bottle and said, this is going to impact your family in the coming year, heaven forbid, now what do you think about a national speed limit? You may well think very differently. But just know that your calculus about your life and the lives of those you love is very different from the calculus of government. It's not out of the question that a government may decide many things that are not in your interests. They may decide, well, let's put it this way, socialism and the Obama health plan unquestionably had what we called death panels. And it's very possible that they either are or will be at work in the next few days in the United States of America, in certain places, maybe the state of New York. It's very possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's very possible that the government or the authorities will make a ruling. These are the people who will get ventilators. Everyone's talking about a shortage of ventilators. Again, I'm not buying into the panic and hysteria. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not at all persuaded it will. But if it does, and there is a shortage of ventilators, is it possible that government will say, your grandpa doesn't get one, and somebody else's sister does get one? Now, that's not a decision you'd make. You have every right to want to get every resource possible for your grandfather or your grandmother, your brother, or whatever it is, but that's not the decision authorities make. So just a little skepticism about government and authorities. Your interests are not synonymous. Your interests are not congruent. Pardon me, wrong word. Your interests are not congruent with those of government and authorities. Public health authorities may well decide a certain number of deaths is preferable to doing this or to doing that. There may be all kinds of decisions. Those are not necessarily decisions that are in your interest. They may be in the interest of what that particular authority deems to be the country, but not necessarily yours. Just be aware of that. Point number 7, tip, tool, and technique number 7, I'm also not going to spend much time on because It'll mean different things to different people, and I'm not going to elaborate in great depth. But the tip is very simple and very concise. It's 7 simple words. You should be able to defend yourself. You should be able to defend yourself. That's all it is. You must be able to defend yourself and your family. Once again, do not count on authorities. When I was hosting a radio show for a few years on KSFO out of San Francisco, it was a station that was picked up in much of California, and so from time to time I would do appearances in the Northern California area, and I became friendly with a number of people in law enforcement, and they told me something which was, I knew I wasn't going to quote by name, but they had no trouble with me passing it on to my audience, and that is that today in most large cities, it is a complete myth that you can dial 911 or any other emergency number to be saved in the case of being threatened by bad guys. It's a myth. He says, at the very best, we'll try and find the people who killed you. He says, but we're not doing very well at that either. In California, in general, in New York, in Baltimore, in a number of other cities, the odds are now better than even that a murderer gets away with a murder. So the idea that somehow all you have to do is dial 911 and everything will be okay. No, that isn't how the world really works. And you probably know this already. So you do need to be able to defend yourself and your family under the most grievous and serious of conditions. I don't want to go in depth into what that means because there are specialists available who will look at your situation, or you can look at your situation and weigh it up in terms of what kind of defense you believe. I will tell you one thing, that learning karate with a hope of being able to defend yourself against bad guys, I love watching contests. I think it's a terrific sport, but the notion that that is an adequate defense today is simply not true. If you have if it's somehow that's what you're going to do, then rather learn to box rather than karate, because it is a contact form of martial arts where you're at least trained to make contact and to inflict pain and damage. Again, this isn't a pleasant topic, is it? But what is advisable? In detail, everybody decides for themselves, but some way of defense. You might decide that a shotgun is your best bet. You might decide that a .38 special revolver is your best bet. And if you do, you might decide that having the first few chambers loaded with shot ammo instead of bullets, that might be a good idea. It might mean that you would be less reluctant to pull the trigger at a time you really need to and should. And again, without training, it is very, very difficult for an ordinary civilian to be able to actually pull the trigger. So I'm very much in favor of getting training from people who know what they're doing, so as that you become able to know that when push comes to shove, you will pull the trigger. There are a lot of concerns, right? There are a lot of reasons to be worried, legal and many other things, but bottom line, you should be able to defend yourself, and that means learning everything you need to know about the legalities and about the technicalities of owning and using a weapon. Number 9. Okay, number 9. Number 9 is a very simple 5 words. Keep clean. Keep clean yourself, your clothing, and your habitation. you might say, well, what's that got to do with a crisis? Because it's one of the first things that we can very easily let go of. Not getting dressed in the morning, right? You're staying home, you're stuck in a home all day. Hey, if with a family you want to have a pajama day one day, fine, go for it. But the rest of the time, a schedule is hugely important. During prisoner of war camps, in every conflict we've been engaged in, the books that get written and the accounts that come back to us are that survival hinged on maintenance of discipline and order and schedule. That when people let themselves go, and getting dirty is incredibly demoralizing. So it's really, really important. Let me tell you a verse, if you don't mind. Deuteronomy Chapter 23, verses 12 through 14. Let me read them real quick. And you must, this is being addressed to the soldier, you must have a digging tool in your equipment pack so that when you relieve yourself, you can dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God walks throughout your camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy, lest he see anything unclean among you and turn away from you. In a nutshell, even in the crisis conditions of military maneuvers, of combat, you still have to relieve yourself in private, and you mustn't leave the excrement lying around. It must be covered up, because God is telling us here of how demoralizing filth can be for us. It's really important. At the University of Texas in 2014, there was a lovely commencement speech delivered by a military man, Admiral William McRaven. It became very famous. You probably heard about it. But what he said was that if you want to make a difference in the world, start by making your bed every morning. And then he gave a really very beautiful speech based on that whole idea. And so, yes, even though we're home, you say to yourself, I'm not going to be even, other than a few minutes on a video conference, I don't have to get dressed. I don't have to comb my hair. Those of us with hair to comb, I don't have to even put on clothing. I can just hang out in pajamas. Don't fall into that trap. Don't let those you are responsible for fall into that trap. Keeping clean yourself and your clothing and your habitation, where you're living, it's really important. Neat, clean, ordered, structured, disciplined, scheduled. Keep operating even more than normal on, if you like, military routine. There's much value in that. I'm not saying that applies to if you're homeschooling your children. And boy, would I be interested to know whether the hundreds of thousands of families who for the first time in their lives are trying homeschool, hundreds of thousands of families who up till now said to themselves, well, I wish I could consider homeschooling my children, take my children out of GICs, government indoctrination camps, and educate them myself so that I can imprint myself indelibly on my own child, so my child will grow up with my values and not those of the GIC. And they've said, no, I wish I could. I have no educational background. I can't teach my kids. I don't know enough. And all of a sudden now they're saying, hey, we've got a great homeschool going. And if people are in that situation, how many of them are going to say when this ends sooner rather than later and normality such as it is will return, how many people will say, you know what, I'm not sending my kids to GICs anymore. We've discovered, you know what, homeschooling is a lot of fun, it's satisfying, and it makes us feel good about our lives because our children are not being turned into treacherous little enemies of everything we hold value in, everything we treat as sacred. And that's really what happens. You might have the most perfect set of traditional Judeo-Christian values in your home. You send your child off to a GIC. Who do you think has more influence? The teacher that's in front of him for 6 or 7 or 8 hours a day, the friends who influence him the rest of the time, or you for a few hours at most of homework and dinner, which usually devolves into arguing. Just think about who has more impact on your children. So that may be a very interesting outcome. I can't wait to see that. That may be very, very interesting. And then finally, the last of the 10 points, number 10. Write. Yes, use this time to write. Get yourself a notebook, and I'm talking now about writing by hand. From a cognitive point of view, you will derive much more benefit in what I'm about to describe if you write by hand than by a keyboard on a device. And I know most of us have less than stellar handwritings, but you'll find that it will improve. So devote some time every day to writing. Okay, what should you write about? Well, I will tell you what I believe you should start with. If to derive maximum benefit, first of all, I think you should be keeping a journal. And I don't know if you've noticed, but Susan and I have prepared a journal, slight nautical theme, but essentially a journal that is designed to help people getting into the writing mode. You'll see it over at our website at rabbidaniellapin.com. Over at the store, take a look at it. It might be just what you need to launch you into something you've been putting off up till now. If you are a regular of the show, you've heard me beg, cajole, plead, and beseech you to start writing. Well, I understand. Time is difficult. You have to prioritize your time. Well, now may be an opportunity to do some writing. So number one, journal. Just record each day. Think about it. We're living through history in the same way that history books describe life during the flu epidemic of 1918. The history books are going to describe the corona pandemic of 2020, and you are living through it. Keep a journal. It'll really be useful. It'll be useful to people in the future who you may want to let read it. Just what you're going through on a day-to-day basis. Keep that journal. The challenges, how you're overcoming them, areas in which you're pleased with how you handled things. Maybe even areas, if you're keeping the journal private, maybe areas in which you're less pleased about how you handled it. Lost my temper with my spouse today. Terrible. I didn't mean to. Never going to happen again. This is what people write in our journals. We all do this. And these things are enormously effective in encouraging growth, stimulating our own development, moving us onwards and upwards. In addition to the journal, you can also write about your future and your past. Now, you might think you should start with your past and then move on to your future. I would recommend the other direction. It is tough and it's painful to write about one's past. It's just hard because none of us feel our pasts are totally without mistake. None of us have pasts without regret. And that's just hard to do. It's hard to write about. And getting used to writing is challenging enough as it is. So do yourself a favor and start off with the future. And so, you could even start off, say to yourself, you could write on a piece of paper you tuck into your notebook. What do I hope to achieve in the rest of my life? What are the values that are going to guide my life from here on forwards? And go ahead and write down the future as you would like to see it. Write down the kind of person you want to grow into. Talk about any skills you'd like to acquire. Speak about relationships, how you want certain relationships to grow and develop. Or maybe you don't have them yet, how you want those relationships to be. Maybe I don't have children yet, but these are the kind of, the relationship I want to have with my children are like this. Write that stuff down. You cannot imagine how powerful a tool this is in bringing about realization. Apart from anything else, it also is incredibly helpful for the quality of your life here and now. It reduces anxiety about uncertainty in the future. It helps let you feel positive about stepping onto the path to the future that you want to engineer for yourself. So make use of this incredibly effective tool of what it essentially does is it allows you to team up your goals with your actions. And that's one of the biggest problems we all have, right? We have certain goals, but we don't do the things we're supposed to do in order to bring about those goals. Best way to achieve it is through writing, defining how you want things to look and the things you need to do in order to achieve those things. So when you've made real headway on that, then you might want to write your autobiography. Go back and look at your life. This is harder, but it's really very, very helpful because it helps you deal with things in the past. You don't need to pay a therapist to listen to you on this. You really only need to put it down on paper, and you would truly be astounded at how helpful you're going to find this to be. Try it. Talk about your background. From your childhood, mistakes you made, things you did well, relationship with parents, relationship with siblings, what went wrong, why did they go wrong, to what extent were you culpable, who was more culpable, how do you think things might have been differently, how you felt. Express your feelings to yourself, not to anyone else necessarily, but express your feelings in your writing as to what it felt like. And you can even think of it as an autobiography. And, you may be somebody who's very private and couldn't dream of anyone else reading your stuff, so make it private. It's not for publication. It's not to be shared. You just might not want it ever to even be found. And there are ways of making sure that after 120 years, your heirs and family won't find it. All of those things, if that's something that bothers you a great deal. Anyway, my friends, that is it for today. Those are the 10 timeless tips, tools, and techniques for tough times. Become a generalist. Number 2, today's strategic timeline ends tonight. Number 3, insulate yourself from public panic and hysteria. Number 4, make new connections. Number 5, cash is king. Number 6, your life and those of your family are more valuable to you than they are to the authorities, and you understand that one. 7, you should be able to defend yourself. Number 8, keep clean yourself, your clothing, and your habitation. That was number 9. Number 10 is maintain optimism by expressing gratitude in your journal. Write. That's what you should be doing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, happy warriors, each and every one of you, you know that I do not believe any of us should be tennis balls floating down the gutter of life. No, we should take charge, and that's exactly what today's show was all about. May God watch over you and keep you safe and healthy, and give you a wonderful week up ahead. A week of good times with your family. I guess not with friends so much, other than through electronic connection, with your finances and with your faith. I am your rabbi. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lappin. God bless.